far away from the actual problems, when we allow ourselves to be isolated, to be disconnected from the problems of the poor and the neglected and confused, I don't think we actually hear the things we need to hear. We don't see the things we need to see. I learned about the power of proximity, not from my work, not from my legal studies. I actually learned about it from my grandmother. I had one of those classic African-American grandmothers. My grandmother was a powerful force in our family. She was tough. She was strong. She was the daughter of enslaved people. My grandmother had this presence about her. She was kind and she was loving, but she was unbending. My grandmother was the end of every argument in our family. My grandmother was also the start of a lot of arguments. And when I was a little boy, my grandmother was always doing these things that were tactical and strategic. And when I was about 9 or 10, she started coming up to me, and she would come up to me, she'd give me these hugs, and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. Then she'd see me an hour later, and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me what I was supposed to do. And every time I would see my grandmother, the first thing I would say to her is, I'd say, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile. I didn't know what she was preparing me for until I was much older. She worked as a domestic her whole life. She lived into her 90s, and then one day she fell, she broke her hip. She developed cancer, and she was dying. I was a college student when she was dying, and I went to see her, and I was sitting next to her bed, and I was just pouring my heart out, because my grandmother meant the world to me, and I was holding her hand, and I was just saying all of these things. And it was time for me to leave, and I knew I wouldn't get a chance to talk to my grandmother again. And I stood up to leave, and I will never forget, just before I walked away, my grandmother opened her eyes, and she squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I'm always going to be hugging you." And I didn't appreciate then the power of those words, but when we get proximate, at a minimum, we can actually wrap our arms around people who are struggling, who have fallen down, who are suffering, and that very gesture is the beginning of how we change things, how we make a witness. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black kids couldn't go to the public schools. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school in our county. And then lawyers came into our community and they made them open up the public schools. And because those lawyers got proximate to poor black kids like me, I got to go to high school. I got to go to college. I come on campuses like this, I meet amazing students like you, and I'm so impressed by all of you, because when I got to college, it was like this world I'd never heard of. Nobody in my family had gone to college before. And I was so completely unprepared in so many ways. I was so excited, and the campus was beautiful, and I was so thrilled to be there. And being on campuses like yours has caused me to reflect on my college experience. And what I realized is that unlike most of you, when I got to college, I was completely uncool. I see college freshmen now, and you all are so much more sophisticated than I was. I remember when I was on college, my freshman year, I was running around, going up to people I didn't know. And I remember what I would frequently do. I'd go up to somebody, I'd say, "Hi, my name is Bryan, I love college." And people would laugh. And I remember going to the cafeteria early in my freshman year, and I sat down next to these kids. I said, "Hi, my name is Bryan, I love college, I'm going to spend the rest of my life in college." And what I remember is these kids got up and they walked away from me. And I remember now that I ate alone a lot during my freshman year. I just wasn't, and I was so excited. I was a philosophy major in college. I got to be a senior, and by the time I was a senior, I started thinking, I'm a senior now. I should get out on the hillside thinking deep philosophical thoughts. And so I go out there and I think like these thoughts, and then one day somebody came over to me and said, "You're a senior, and you're a philosophy major. What are you going to do when you graduate from college?" And I heard this as a very hostile question because I realized nobody was going to hire me to philosophize when I graduated from college. So I frantically tried to figure out how to stay in school, and because nobody in my family had gone to college, I didn't know, and I'm sure everybody here already knows, I didn't know that in this country, if you want to do graduate work in history or English or political science, to get admitted to graduate school, you have to know something about history, English, or political science. I was very intimidated by this. I kept looking, and to be honest, that's how I found my way to law school. It was very clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that. And a few months later, found myself sitting in a classroom at Harvard Law School, deeply disillusioned. And I was disillusioned because I went to law school because I was concerned about racial inequality, I was concerned about the poor, I was concerned about social injustice, and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about poverty or racial injustice or inequality. And I decided it wasn't for me. I decided to leave. I finished my first year and I left. And I went over to the School of Government. I was going to get a degree in public policy. And I remember the day, 2 months into that program, where I woke up one morning and I looked in the mirror and I thought, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs. But it didn't seem to matter whose benefits got maximized and whose costs got minimized. And I found that very alienating. And I went back to the law school, and that's when I started to do this thing that I urge all of you not to do. I started to do this thing and I began trying to rationalize accepting a career in the law that I knew was not going to be fulfilling. I began to try to persuade myself that the privilege of education isn't that we get to make choices about what we do with our lives. I tried to accept this idea that I wasn't really capable of creating the kind of life that would animate my head and my heart. And then, in the midst of that crisis, I got proximate. I took a course that required me to go to Georgia and work with condemned prisoners. And I went to Atlanta, Georgia, and I found this community of lawyers who got up early in the morning. We worked hard all day. They asked me to go to death row and meet someone they hadn't had time to meet. I got up the next morning to go down to death row. I drove my car down there, and I was so nervous. I'd never been to death row before. I'd never been inside a prison before. And I was worried that this man would be disappointed when he realized I was just a law student. I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say. I got down there, I parked my car, I went into the prison. They took me back to the visitation room, and I was pacing, waiting for this condemned man. And finally, they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned prisoner I'd ever seen. And what I remember about him was how burdened with chains he was. He had handcuffs on his wrist, he had a chain around his waist, he had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain him. Finally, when they had him unchained, he walked over to me, and I was so nervous. I forgot all the things I'd rehearsed to say, and I just said, I'm so sorry. I said, I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know much about criminal procedure. I don't know much about civil procedure. I don't know much about appellate procedure. I don't know much, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year, and someone will be down at some point. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait. Say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and my kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I'd have an execution date. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. He said, thank you. And I couldn't believe how even in my ignorance, being proximate allowed me to have an impact on someone's life. It allowed me to make a difference, even in ignorance. I couldn't deny the power of that. That man and I started talking. It turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I started asking him questions about his life. We got lost in conversation. And I was only scheduled to be there for an hour, but 1 hour turned into 2 hours. And 2 hours turned into 3 hours, and we were still talking. The guards were waiting outside, and they got angry that we were way past the time. And after 3 hours, they couldn't take it any longer. And these guards came running into the room, and they were so angry that they took it out on this client. They threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms back, and they put the handcuffs on his chain so roughly I could see the metal pinching his skin. I begged them to be gentle, but they ignored me. They wrapped the chain around his waist, and they put the shackles back on his ankles. I kept begging them to please be gentle. They were treating him so roughly, but they ignored me. The condemned man looked at me, and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then they started shoving this man toward the door. I could see him almost fall. And when they got him near the door, I was watching carefully. And they got him near the door, and I saw him plant his feet. And when he planted his feet, he turned to me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then that man did something I've never, ever forgotten. I stood there and I watched him close his eyes. And then he threw his head back. And then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. He said, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Everybody stopped. The guards were covered in him. They started pushing him down the hallway. You could hear the chains clanging, but you could also hear this man singing about higher ground. And I'm here to tell you that when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me. That was the moment that I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And if I'm any kind of lawyer, if I have any kind of skill as a litigator, if I've had any impact in the clients that I've represented in the courts where I've worked, it's because I got proximate to a condemned man on death row who sang to me about higher ground. When I got back to Harvard Law School, you couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about comedy and federalism. It radicalized my interest in the law. And I tell you that story because I believe our power, our insight, our wisdom, our capacity to change the world is waiting for us if we get proximate to the poor and the excluded. It's not just here on campus. It's not just in the classrooms. It's in places where people are suffering. It's in places where people are hungry. It's in places where people don't have a place to live. It's in places where people are incarcerated, hopeless, without a clear way to go. We have to get closer to those places if we're going to change the world. But proximity won't be enough by itself. The second thing I'm persuaded we have to do is we have to change some of the narratives underneath these policy issues that we hear all the time, hear about on the news all the time. We talk about all these issues: immigration, education, economic issues. We hear all of these issues, but underneath the issues there are narratives. And we have to understand those narratives, and we have to work on changing some of those narratives. We have mass incarceration in this country because we declared a misguided war on drugs. We said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent, we said those people are criminals. And we use that narrative to demonize hundreds of thousands of people. We put hundreds of thousands of people in jails and prisons. Now, we did not have to make that choice. We could have said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent have a health problem, and we need our healthcare system to respond to that problem. But that wasn't the narrative we elected, and we didn't choose that narrative because I think we were being governed by fear and anger. And I believe that fear and anger are the essential ingredients of inequality. When we allow ourselves to be shaped by fear, when we allow ourselves to be governed and controlled by anger, we become vulnerable to those dynamics where people get oppressed, where people get unfairly treated. Go any place in the world where there's oppression. If you ask the oppressors why they do what they do, they'll give you a narrative of fear and anger. And I believe we have to change those narratives. We can't allow our hearts to be shaped by fear and anger. Those are not the ingredients that lead us to justice, to grace, to redemption. I've seen what it's done to children. We had people in this country going around 30 years ago arguing that there was a new species of child in the United States. And they said these kids may look like kids and sound like kids and sometimes act like kids, but these criminologists argue these are not children. They came up with a new word. They said these aren't children. They said these are, quote, super predators. They used that label to demonize a generation of children, mostly black and brown kids. And every state in the country began lowering the minimum age for trying children as adults. It happened in Utah, it happened in Alabama, it happened in New York, it happened everywhere. And we began putting young children in adult jails and prisons. 13 and 14-year-old children were being sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Even today, we have 13 states with no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. I sometimes represent 9 and 10-year-old kids who are facing 40 and 50-year prison sentences, and we put some of these children in adult jails and prisons, and it created cruel and painful things. I worked on a case some years ago in Bali, a 14-year-old boy who lived in a house where his mother would sometimes be the target of domestic violence. This boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when that man would start drinking, sometimes he'd get violent. And one day the man had been drinking, and he came home, and he walked into the kitchen, and he called the boy's mother into the kitchen, and he went over to her, and he just punched her in the face. She fell. She hit her head while she fell. She was on the floor, bleeding and unconscious. Her son came running into the kitchen to help his mom. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to get her to wake up, but she was non-responsive. The man went into her bedroom and fell asleep, and so the little boy got up after 10 minutes. He thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. He went into the bedroom. He was going to call the police or an ambulance, but then he remembered that this man kept a handgun in the dresser drawer. And so this little boy went over to the door and he pulled out the gun and he walked over to where the man was sleeping and he pointed the gun at the man's head. The man was snoring. And after a few minutes, the man stopped snoring and jumped, and the little boy jumped, and he pulled the trigger and shot the man in the head, killing him instantly. Tragic. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall. He weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before I got involved in this case. I went to the jail to see this little boy, and when he walked in, I was stunned by how terrified he looked. I sat down and I started asking him questions, but no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything. He just sat there. And finally, I put my pen down. I said, "Look, I can't help if you don't talk to me. You got to talk to me." The little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, I walked around the table, I pulled my chair closer and said, "No, you got to talk to me. I can't help if you don't talk to me." And he just kept staring at the wall. I couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I just leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him. I said, "Come on, you got to talk to me. I can't help you if you don't talk to me." And that's when this little boy started to cry. And through his tears, began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. He told me on the first night several men had hurt him. He told me on the next night he'd been assaulted, sexually assaulted by several people. He told me on the night before I got there, so many people had hurt him. He couldn't remember how many there had been, and I held this little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. I finally got him calm. I said, "Look, you stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here." And we'll never forget trying to leave that jail. That little boy grabbed me by the arm. He said, "Please, please don't go. Please don't go." I said, "No, it's okay. It's all right. I'm going to get you out of here." And when I left the jail, the question I had in my mind is, who is responsible for this? And the answer is, we are. We are. We've allowed this distance to be created between where we are and the most vulnerable children in our society. We've allowed these narratives to be created that some children aren't children. I am committed to changing the narrative. I believe that all children are children. I don't think we show our commitment to children, our love for children, our investment in children by how well we treat privileged kids and talented kids and gifted kids. I think our love and our commitment has to be expressed in how we deal with problematic children, children who are poor, children who are abused, children who are struggling. That's what it means to show our commitment to children. The narrative has to change. I think the narrative has to change about race in America. I don't think we're free. I think we're burdened by a history of racial inequality that hangs over us like smog. It's in the air. It's out here in Utah. It's where I live in Alabama. It's in the Northeast. It's in the Northwest. It's everywhere. There is this history of racial inequality that we haven't talked about. And because we haven't talked about it, it continues to burden us. We're not free. And I think we have to change the narrative of racial difference that we've inherited. We've got to talk about some things that we haven't talked about before. I think we have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. What happened in this country when Europeans came, what we did to Native people was a genocide. We killed millions of Native people through famine and war and disease. We kept their words, we kept their names, Utah, all of these things, but we made the people leave. And we created this narrative of racial difference to justify the violence. We said, oh, those Native people, they're savages. And that rhetoric, that view, we use to get comfortable with this violence and victimization. It's that narrative of racial difference that made us comfortable with 2 centuries of slavery. And I don't think the great evil of American slavery was involuntary servitude and forced labor. I really believe the true evil of American slavery was the narrative we created about black people. We said black people are different than white people. Black people aren't fully human. Black people aren't evolved. They can't do this, they can't do that. The Supreme Court said we're 3/5 human. And that narrative of racial difference, the ideology of white supremacy that we created to justify enslavement, that was the true evil. And when we passed the 13th Amendment, we talked about ending involuntary servitude and ending forced labor, but we didn't say anything about ending this narrative of racial difference. And because of it, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism. Black people were pulled out of their homes, they were burned, they were murdered, they were drowned, they were hanged, they were lynched. This era of lynching was terrorism. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and say, Mr. Stevenson, we get angry when we hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We grew up being menaced and threatened and bombed. The demographic geography of this nation was shaped by racial terror. The black people in Los Angeles, the black people in Oakland and Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit did not go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South that we haven't talked about. We had the civil rights movement, but even there we've kind of made it too celebratory. We haven't talked about the narrative of racial difference and the way it persists. And today we're still living at a time where even if you're a gifted BYU student, even if you're a faculty member, even if you're talented, even if you are kind and you love everybody, you can go places in this country. And if you're a person of color and you're still a member of this community, you have to worry about navigating presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. You're going to have to navigate that narrative of racial difference. And as you get older, it starts to weigh on you. In South Africa, they won't let you spend time there without talking about apartheid and the damage that was done. Their constitutional court is surrounded by monuments and emblems that are designed to make sure they never forget about the brutality, the wrongfulness of apartheid. In Rwanda, every Rwandan will make sure you understand what they went through during the genocide. You can't spend 2 days there without hearing about it. Go to Berlin, Germany. In Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial. They're trying to change the narrative. They don't want to be thought of as Nazis and fascists for the rest of their time. They want to talk about what their country has been through. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We have a hard time talking about race. We're going to have to change the narrative if we want to be free. I don't believe we can create a just society by ignoring the smog in the air. Even changing the narrative won't be enough. We've got to be proximate. We've got to change narratives. But the third thing I think we have to do, we're going to create healthier communities. We've got to stay hopeful. And it seems odd for me to come into a beautiful place like this and talk about hope, but I'm really persuaded that we've got to be hopeful people. I'm persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And if we're not hopeful, we're not able to do the things that we're supposed to do. Many of you are students here who came here with all these aspirations. And one of the difficulties about being on a college campus is life gets complicated. The faculty are actually paid to complicate the world for you. They're trying to confuse it, and they're not trying to do anything malicious. The world is complicated and it's confusing, and sometimes if we're not careful, we begin to get hopeless about what we can do. We lose our aspirations. We begin to think that we can't do the things that made us want us to be here in the first place, and we've got to fight against that hopelessness. Our hope is our superpower. Hope is what gets you to stand up sometimes when other people say, sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say, be quiet. Hope is the way the world changes. It is at the heart of the Gospels. It's the way we have oriented ourselves. And we've got to fight against the things that make us hopeless. I had the privilege of knowing Rosa Parks as a young lawyer. When I got to Montgomery, this woman named Johnny Carr, an older black woman, called me and she said, Bryan, I understand you're a young lawyer just moved to Montgomery. I said, yes, I am. She said, well, my name is Johnny Carr. I'm the architect of the Montgomery bus boycott. And she said, if you're a young lawyer come to town, I'm going to call you up sometimes and I'm going to ask you to go some places and speak. And then she said, sometimes I'm going to call you up and ask you to go some places and listen. And she said, when I call you up and ask you to do something, you're going to say, yes, ma'am. So I said, yes, ma'am. She would send me places to speak and send me places to listen. Then one day she called me, she said, Bryan, Rosa Parks is coming to town. And we're going to get together at Virginia Durr's house and we're going to talk. Do you want to come over and listen? I said, oh, yes, ma'am, I do. And every now and then this car would say, she'd say, Bryan, what does the word listen mean? And I'd have to explain to her that I knew I wasn't supposed to say anything when I got over there. And I went over to Virginia Durr's house, this white woman whose husband, Clicker Durr, represented Dr. King and Miss Parks in his car. And Miss Durr just talked for 2 hours, and I sat there and I soaked it all in. It was so powerful, and they were so passionate. And the amazing thing was that they had this hope that you could almost touch. And they weren't talking about the things they had done. They were talking about the things they were still going to do. It was incredible. And I sat there for 2 hours soaking it all in. And then at one point, Miss Parks turned to me. She said, now, Bryan, Tell me about the Equal Justice Initiative. Tell me what you're trying to do. And I looked over to Ms. Carr to see if I had permission to speak, and she nodded. And so I turned to Ms. Carr and I gave her my whole rap. I said, we're trying to do something about the death penalty. We're trying to do something about excessive punishment. We're trying to end mass incarceration. We're trying to help children prosecuted as adults. We're trying to help the mentally ill in our jails and prisons. We want to do something about our criminal justice system. We want to help conditions of confinement. We're trying to help the poor. We're trying to talk about race. I gave her my whole rap. And when I finished, she looked at me and she said, She said, that's going to make you tired. And that's when Ms. Carr leaned forward and she put her finger on my face. She said, that's why you've got to be brave. And I tell you that because it takes courage to stay hopeful when there's so much division, when there's so much hate, when there's so much complexity, when there are people who are rooted in fear and anger, but our hope is key. We've got to get proximate, we've got to change narratives, we've got to stay hopeful. But the fourth and final thing we're going to have to do, we want things to change. And this is the hard one. We've got to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. We cannot change the world. We can't create more justice if we insist on only doing what's comfortable and convenient. And I hate that. I do. But because we're human. And humans are biologically and psychologically programmed to do what's comfortable, to do what's convenient. We like comfort. But unfortunately, we can't change things. We can't make things better if we're not willing to do uncomfortable things. I've done some research on this. I've looked for some examples where justice prevailed, where equality triumphed, where liberty was protected and nobody had to do anything uncomfortable or inconvenient. I can't find any examples of that. It only happens when good people make the choice to do the uncomfortable. And that means we have to do these hard things. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against comfort. I'm not saying that. Look, I like comfort just like everybody else. I gave a talk down in Mississippi. The people met me at the airport. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of lawyer you are. We know what kind of work you do. They said, we read your book. And they said, Mr. Stevenson, we have to tell you that we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. They said, we decided that you would not want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. They said, we've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the barn. I said, what is wrong with you? So of course I want to stay in the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those chocolate chip cookies just like everybody else. No, what I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to position yourself in difficult places. I've had the privilege of representing people and seeing people gain victory to recover their lives. That little boy I was telling you about, we got him out of there. We got him into a different place, and these wonderful people have embraced this young man, and he's grown up, and he's recently graduated from college, just became an engineer, he's married. He calls me from time to time, and when he calls me, it gives me this joy I can't even measure. But I will also tell you that some difficult moments. I've stood with condemned people. I did a case some years ago where an intellectually disabled man couldn't get relief, and we were trying to save him. And we got to the day of the execution, and the Supreme Court called my office about an hour before the execution and said, we're not going to grant a stay. And that's when I had to do the hardest thing I had to do in my work. I had to get on the phone with this man, and I called him and I said, I'm so sorry, but I can't stop this execution. And then the man did the thing I dread the most in my work. He started to cry. And he was sobbing within a few seconds. And I was holding the phone while this man was sobbing. And then he said, Mr. Stevenson, please don't hang up. There's something really important that I have to say to you. He was intellectually disabled. And he tried to say something to me, but in addition to being intellectually disabled, when he got nervous, when he got overwhelmed, he had this other challenge. He would begin to stutter. He had a speech impediment. And all of a sudden, this young man could not get out a single word. He kept trying to talk. He kept trying to say something, but he couldn't get his words. And he kept trying, and he kept trying, and he kept trying, and he kept failing. And before I realized it, I was standing there holding the phone, and tears were running down my face. The harder he tried and failed, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. It was so uncomfortable that my mind actually wandered. And I started remembering during the night of this execution, when I was about 9 or 10, my mom had taken me to church one Sunday, and I was there talking with my friends, and I remember being there talking, this little skinny kid just standing there not saying a word. And I remember turning to this kid and asking him, what's your name, where are you from? And that little boy tried to answer my question, and I remembered how that little boy also had a speech impediment, and he couldn't get his words out either, and he stuttered terribly. And then I remembered that I did something really ignorant, and that little boy couldn't get his words out right. I remembered that I laughed. And my mother saw me laughing at this little boy, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came over and she grabbed me by the arm and she pulled me aside. And she said, Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. And I tried to apologize, and my mom said, no, you know better than that. And then my mother looked at me, she said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and my mom grabbed me by the arm. She said, wait, after you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy. I sort of rolled my eyes, but I said, okay, Mom. And I took a step, and then she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, wait, after you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and tell that little boy I love him. She gave me that look again, so I said, all right. And on the night of this execution, I remember going over to this little boy, and I walked up to him and I said, look, man, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then I remember sort of lunging at him and giving him my little boy version of a man hug. And then I remember trying to say to this child as insincerely as I possibly could, I said, look, man, I don't know, I don't know, I love you. And what I'd forgotten was how that little boy hugged me back. And then I remembered how he whispered flawlessly in my ear. He said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while my client was trying to get his words out. And finally my client got his words out. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for representing me. He said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for fighting for me. And the last thing that man said to me, he said, Mr. Stevenson, I love you for trying to save my life. He hung up the phone, they pulled him away, they strapped him to a gurney, and they executed him. I hung up the phone and said, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. It's too much. It was too uncomfortable. It was too painful. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the questions I had in my mind is, why do we want to kill all the broken people? What is it about us that when we see brokenness and other people, we get angry, we want to crush it, and we want to hurt it? And then I realized that all of my clients are broken people. I represent the broken. And then I realized that I sometimes work in a system that's broken because there is no willingness to get proximate. There is no hope. People are rooted in fear and anger. And I said, I can't do this anymore. It just felt too much. And I sat down and said, I'm not going to do this work anymore. And I was sitting there in agony. And all of a sudden something said, you better think about why you do what you do. And I was sitting there in such distress. And I was in such agony. And then all of a sudden I had this realization I'd never had before. That was the night when I realized why I do what I do. It took me by shock. I was sitting there trying to make sense of this. And then I realized why I do what I do. And what I realized is that I don't do what I do because I've been trained as a lawyer. I don't do what I do because someone has to do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, no one will. I don't do what I do because it's about human rights and justice. What I realized that night that I'd never realized before is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth is that if you get proximate, if you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, if you do uncomfortable things, there will be moments when you feel like you're scratched and broken and battered. There will be tears, but I'm here to tell you that it is the broken among us that can teach us the way mercy is supposed to work. It's the broken that understand the power of redemption. It's the broken that can actually show us the way justice can redeem and lift up. It's no problem being broken when we're saying we need to change the world. We don't have to be whole and perfect. We just have to have that heart. We've got to get proximate, change narratives, stay hopeful, and do uncomfortable things. I believe really simple things. I believe that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe that for every human being. My faith tells me that. I believe that someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if someone takes something, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer, and justice requires that we know the other things you are. I am persuaded that in this country, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I think we sometimes talk too much about money. I am persuaded that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we do justice, we deconstruct the conditions that give rise to poverty. And finally, I believe that on this campus, in this beautiful community, we're not going to be judged by how successful we are, how many beautiful things we can create, by how we treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged. I believe we're going to be judged by how we treat the poor, the excluded, the neglected. There's a different metric system when you're trying to change the world. I'll end with this. For all of you students, I want you to study hard, be great scholars, study. We need you to be smart and informed. But I want to tell you before I leave, you should never think that your grades are a measure of your capacity to change the world, because they're not. When you leave this place, you need to get a good job. I want you to be able to take care of your friends and family. But I also want to say to you, don't ever think that your income is a measure of your capacity to change the world. There's a different metric system for those of you who are trying to change the world. It was taught to me by this older man. I was giving a talk in a church, and this older man came into the church. He was in a wheelchair, older black man. And he was staring at me with this stern, angry look on his face. I couldn't figure out, why is he looking at me so sternly? And I got through my talk, and people came up, and they were very nice after the talk was over, but that older black man was just sitting in the back, just staring with this stern, angry look. And when the other people walked away, he rolled himself to the front of the church, and when he got in front of me, he put his hand up. He said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I mumbled something. I don't even remember what I said. Then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And that's when this older black man looked at me. He says, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." He said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved because I just didn't know what was about to happen. Then this man grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me to his wheelchair. He said, "Come here, come here, come here. I'm going to show you something." This man turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have here on the right side of my head?" He said, "I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this scar?" He said, "I got this scar down here at the bottom of my neck in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." He said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me, they think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "Well, I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These are not my cuts. These are not my bruises. These are not my scars." He looked at me, he said, "Young man," he said, "these are my medals of honor." I think we honor what it means to be a healthy community, a strong community, a community committed to justice when we find ways to get closer to those in need, when we change narratives, when we stay hopeful, when we do uncomfortable things. You have honored me by inviting me to have this opportunity to share with you. I can't tell you what it means to me to be here with you. It excites me, but more than that, it excites me that as a community, we can do things that change the world, that create more justice. I'm excited for what you can do. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. I just want to wish all of you God's greatest blessings. Thank you very, very much.